This is a list of what many people consider the greatest books ever written. But it's not just one list, it's a compilation of hundreds of rankings across space and time with varying criteria for inclusion, different people making the collections, different expertise. So, in theory, this should be the closest thing we have to a universal literary canon. Of course, that is subjective to an extent. But as I looked through this list, a couple of things began troubling me. I can see why most of these books are here, but some of the reasons feel a little bit contradictory. Some strike me as much loved classics, other books feel like they're more out of scholarly obligation on a list like this. And a few I genuinely don't understand how they survive this filtering process. Now, there's a lot of reasons why a book might be on a list like this. What exactly the lines are drawn, what is considered, what isn't considered, what's a book, does it include poems? It's interesting. This list is distilled down from 123 works that each featured on 10 plus reputable lists. What criteria, what's reputable? I guess we'll find out. But I had to pick a cutoff point, so I'll put the whole list in the description, but today I'm just going through the top 75 books or works of fiction of all time. So I'm curious to see if the internet got it right or not. It looks like there might be some interesting controversial picks here, so this should be a good list, but hopefully by the end of this, we will either have a great case for the internet's take on the canon or some serious questions. This is going to be a bit of a longer video than normal, so please feel free to listen to it or to jump ahead, but let's get right into it. We're starting at the bottom of the list here, and I can see that I happen to have the first book on my pile because I was talking about it in a recent video. So let's dive in. Right at number 75, we have Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut. So this is an interesting place to start. Already a bit of an unorthodox pick, but I like it. Slaughterhouse-Five is a great satirical novel about war and trauma, and it's told in this really distinct nonlinear way. Excellent novel, very weird, but I mean, that's kind of what you expect with Vonnegut. It's a great novel, so I like this pick here. Number 74, Out of Africa. This one's more of a novella. It's a memoir set in colonial Kenya that has what I would call a nostalgic, romantic, reflective tone. This is one of the most beautifully written short novels I've read. So I like this pick here, but this one has become rather controversial in the way that people usually describe as a product of its time, which I personally find a bizarre criticism, as if anything isn't a product of its time, but it will be interesting to see how this book holds up. Number 73, The Count of Monte Cristo, another one that I happen to have right on my list right here. I love this one. This should be way higher in my opinion. I always feel like this one gets considered a classic, but it's kind of looked down on compared to other classics by critics and contrarians also because it's so popular. I think this is a contender for possibly the most riveting novel ever written. Um, you know, in my view at least, it's a revenge epic built on a remarkable patience. It's got great themes, betrayal, transformation. So good. 72 is Tales by Edgar Allan Poe, so the Telltale Heart it's featuring. Okay. Yeah, I'm so glad that Edgar Allan Poe made the list. I mean, that would have been a big omission. And I think that definitely taking his collected short stories is a fair way to classify this, as he's probably best known as a short story writer, though he has some amazing poems as well, some of which, I love. It was many and many a year ago in a kingdom by the sea that a maiden there lived whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. Anyways, he's so good. So Poe, his stories are great, and I think you could probably describe it as gothic short stories, obsessed with ideas like guilt and madness and the personification of death. Um, this definitely belongs on a list like this, just based on how impactful and unique Poe was as a writer. Uh, you know, he's probably also underrated due to his popularity, much like Dumas. So these stories are must reads. They still feel really psychologically relevant and sharp. Number 71, Frankenstein. I've done a number of videos on this, so at the very least, this is probably one of the best books written by a teenager, maybe the best. But it's more than that, I think. It's a great story, eerily, kind of like AI creation. The nature of creative responsibility, consequences of alienation. It's more philosophical than most modern sci-fi, and it's arguably maybe the most important proto sci-fi novels. So this book is wonderful. This is a great list so far. Moving swiftly along, and we'll go a bit faster here because we've got a lot to get through. We got number 70 is Robinson Crusoe. Oh man, this is a great one. Often considered the first major English language work that can properly be considered a novel. It's probably enough to be on this list just because of historical impact, but this is a great novel about survival and isolation and self-reliance. Does that make sense? 69 is The Tempest. Of course, anything by Shakespeare can rightly be considered on a list like this, but this is a great one. And plus, I played Ferdinand in my high school production of The Tempest, so I guess I'm legally obligated to praise this one, even if I hate it, which I don't. A couple interesting things on The Tempest. It's a great play about the nature of power and the power of forgiveness. It's also it's just so cool how it explores illusion in genius and funny ways. Many scholars see this as Shakespeare reflecting on the nature of theater itself. So wonderful pick. Waiting for Godot, wonderful play in the absurdist theater style. The premise is two men wait endlessly for somebody who never arrives. For what it's worth, I love Beckett. I agree that this has a good place, a good pick for a list like this. 67, Animal Farm, great short book, political allegory about revolution turning into tyranny. Simple but effective. Orwell is great. I like this one, in the 60 to 70 range. So I think that's a fair placement. Yeah, Animal Farm, huge impact, great book. 66, The Cherry Orchard. Love it. Okay, Chekhov, one of my favorite Russians. So this is wonderful to see him on a list like this. Yeah, you know, if you've never seen or experienced The Cherry Orchard, I highly recommend it. Very interesting take on memory and the rise and fall or the change in social standing. So that's pretty cool. Number 65, A Doll's House. Honestly, for Ibsen, I personally prefer Hedda Gabler. I think that's one of the greatest plays ever written for a variety of reasons, which I won't get into here, but I can see why they included A Doll's House. This exists in the zeitgeist as a very, I think it exists as a very different play than the one that one actually encounters upon reading it. This is a very misunderstood play in my view, much studied and argued over, but definitely deserves to be on a list like this for its impact and also Ibsen's a great writer. 64, Leaves of Grass. Okay, so we are including poetry here too. This changes things a bit, but I agree. If we're including poets, then this is definitely an essential, addition. Walt Whitman's influence on the, I don't know, like transcendentalism, selfhood, democracy, all these themes, so important. So he's hard to underestimate. I love this. What? Is this a dagger I see before me? It is indeed number 63. We have Macbeth. Great pick. I'm surprised this isn't a little bit higher up, to be honest. This is a wonderfully tragic, nihilistic play about how, no matter how you slice it, this deserves to be on the list. It's about a lot of themes. It's hard to kind of condense into one thing. It's impactful, brilliant, it's super quotable. Like I said earlier, or by the pricking of my thumb, something wicked this way comes, or tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. So many phrases, ideas, tropes, and notions from this play have become ingrained in the English language. Shakespeare's influence is second to none, both as a writer and on the English language itself. So this is a great. Richard III at 62. Okay, so we're sticking with Shakespeare. What do I want to say about Richard III? This is another essential play. If Macbeth is the tragic figure who becomes kind of the tormented tyrant, Richard III is the total unrepentant tyrant. Nobody explores the psychological and philosophical and political depth of tyranny like Shakespeare does. Every freedom lover should read Richard III. Number 61, Love in the Time of Cholera. Okay, so now we have Gabriel Garcia Marquez. So this is the first one I haven't read, so we've actually done pretty well so far on this list. I like Marquez, so there's that. I've read a lot about this book, so I can see the case as strong for its inclusion here, but I'll kind of refrain from saying much more. Number 60, Catch-22. This is a favorite book by a couple of people I really admire, including another booktuber. Shout out to Life on Books. Another military and bureaucratic satire. Definitely, in many ways, this is kind of in the same vein as something like Slaughterhouse-Five or something by Kafka, though it's definitely different. Yeah, so far this list does make me wonder what criterion are most important here. Is it books that are much loved or impactful or critically acclaimed? On the one hand, I'm a little confused by the criteria, but on the other hand, I guess if we aggregate a lot of lists, the ultimate list will necessarily contain many different kinds of works for many different reasons. So maybe it's not such a big problem. Anyways, moving swiftly along here. At number 59, we have The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. This is one of my favorite books ever. I've read it so many times. It never gets old. It's an epic fantasy story on the surface, but really it's about everything, the virtues and faults of humanity, power, war, corruption, friendship, what really matters at the end of the journey. And it's exceedingly deep in its morals and virtue. I love this novel. And I guess you should consider it a novel and not a trilogy. And I love Tolkien generally. I even had a chance to visit his grave when I was living in the UK. So, anyways, great pick here. Number 58, The Old Man and the Sea. Okay. Yes. So I like this. I feel like this is probably the most accessible Hemingway novel or novella, if you're excluding his short stories. Even for people who don't really like his other work, this seems like it's very popular. So I can see why they included this one. Maybe they'll include some of his other works later on as well. I approve. Old Man and the Sea, great themes, great story. I've spoken about this one as well. The Little Prince. Okay, I love it. I definitely approve of this. Great story, great writer, great lore. The biography is amazing. Anyways, but if we're talking children's novels, I better see Wind in the Willows on this list too. So, it's expanding a bit. Number 56, Absalom, Absalom. Another one I haven't read and need to read. Faulkner has, of course, to be on a list like this, and this kind of makes sense that he would include Absalom, Absalom. He really dominates the post-Civil War Southern Gothic kind of tradition. So he's a great novelist, great short story writer. I can see why this is here. Number 55, yes. Okay, we have Les Miserables, or Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. I agree wholeheartedly. I would definitely rank this one higher on account of its heroism, on account of the story, on account of just how epic this is. This is one of the greatest novels I've ever read. It's a massive novel about justice and suffering and redemption. It also inspired a wonderful French musical, which was adapted into Broadway in the 1980s. So I highly recommend this as well. Number 54, Great Expectations. Yes, great coming-of-age story. Dickens is definitely one of the most influential writers in the English language. I love how he explores class and ambition, and honestly, so many other complex themes. He does so without letting his politics get in the way or negate the complexity of human nature. So that's one of the things I appreciate most about Dickens. He's got his moral compass, but he explores human nature very honestly. So very rich novel. Definitely can see the inclusion here. Number 53 is Faust. Okay, Goethe. I just started reading this actually 2 days ago. So this one's kind of fresh in my mind. It's about a man who trades his soul for knowledge and experience, the Faustian bargain. And even without having finished it, I can say that the impact of this alone merits a place here. It's a foundational story with earlier antecedents like Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus. So this whole tradition of Faustian literature is super important. But I do think Faust is probably, head and shoulders above anything else, with the possible exception of Dr. Faustus. So yeah, I definitely can see how this deserves a place on this list. So we will see if Dr. Faustus comes along or later on. Number 52 is Paradise Lost. Yes, this is an epic poem written by a very interesting heterodox thinker, John Milton, about the fall of man and Satan's rebellion. It's interesting how much his spin on the early chapters of the Hebrew Bible has influenced how the Western world basically conceptualizes Satan and God and the serpent and Adam and Eve and the fall of man. Reread the original, and I think you might be surprised to find it different than the way you remembered. You can thank Milton for that. So Paradise Lost gives wonderful depth and voice to evil, totally transformed the way that we interpreted an even more foundational and ancient text. Next to Shakespeare and maybe someone like Chaucer, possibly, he's probably the most influential writer in English. So yeah, this needs to be on the list, probably should be higher. Number 51, Labyrinths by Jorge Luis Borges, a collection of philosophical stories about time, reality, infinity. This is definitely, Borges is definitely much loved in the academic circles, and this is definitely one of his most famous works. But if you read him, especially if you read him in Spanish, I think you'll see why he's so loved, why he's so much touted as one of the great literary thinkers. He's got what I guess I'd call psychological depth. I don't know which work by Borges I would choose if I was making this list. One could definitely make a case for a few of his different collections, but he needs to be here one way or the other. So maybe they'll come up later, but that's a good pick. Labyrinths by Borges. Number 50. Okay, we're in the top 50. Tales by Chekhov. The Lady with the Dog. Okay. So The Lady with the Dog is an excellent short story, but I'm not sure exactly where they're drawing the lines with short fiction on this list. Sometimes it seems like they include authors' entire oeuvre in one, and at other times they seem to split it up. So at first I thought, it was just dependent on if it was published at the same time, but it seems like there's a couple inconsistencies. But uh, okay, that's neither here nor there. If we're considering Chekhov's short stories as one, honestly, I'd probably rank this higher. The Lady with the Dog is a great one to feature, but he's got so many wonderful short stories. The Bet is great. The Student is great. Ward Number 6 is great. He was also a doctor when he wasn't, changing the literary landscape. So Chekhov is awesome. One of my favorite Russians. I would rank this higher, but Chekhov's short stories definitely needs to be on a top 100 list. Okay, 49 more. So I'm loving this list so far, to be honest. I think that, there's a couple of flustering things going on, but to be honest, I I think it's pretty good. So I'm just going to take a sip of water before we continue. Okay, number 49, David Copperfield. That's fair. This is probably the best Dickens novel for a greatest books of all time list, though I'm not sure I would say it's my absolute favorite of his books. It is a contender, though. It's a long one, super readable. It's a semi autobiographical coming of age story. Charles Dickens, CD, becomes David Copperfield, DC, so you see what he kind of does there. But it's all about personal and moral growth and the value of persisting through hardship. So this is a great novel. Um, Definitely belongs on this list. Yeah, I agree. Number 48, A Midsummer Night's Dream. Nice to see Shakespeare comedy on this list. So we had a couple of tragedies so far. Comedy in theater is, happy endings, usually the rise of a character to marriage or something like this, and tragedy is the descent of a character into death or ruin. Um, so it's not necessarily funny, laugh out loud funny, although in the case of Shakespeare, it kind of is both. I think I'd personally rank, Midsummer Night's Dream. Well, I would rank Macbeth higher than Midsummer Night's Dream, but I'll cut myself off on this. I've already agreed that this belongs to this list, and you all know that I love the Bard, so that's a fair pick. It's a fair pick. So far, I agree with all these picks. I might just reorder them a little bit. Number 47, Medea. Okay, glad to see the Greeks here. Euripides. This is a classic one. You'll definitely study this if you take like a classics program in university. It's a great tragedy about revenge in the classic Greek tragic fashion. So it does not hold any punches. Imagine if they had parental guides back then. Oh my goodness, nothing would ever get made. Anyways, I digress. Medea, good pick. Number 46, Brave New World. Okay, how long do we have? No, I won't say too much about this one. This is a dystopian novel about control through pleasure, drugs, stability, ease, entertainment, rather than super totalitarian measures. I think it's, is this the more accurate version of 1984, you may ask, right? Maybe. Either way, this is an important novel, so this definitely belongs on a list like this. I love this book, so yes, Brave New World. Number 45, To the Lighthouse. Oh, this is another one that I have right here. I was talking about this in a previous video. To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. I mentioned in my last video I haven't actually read this yet, but it doesn't seem out of place based on what I know. Virginia Woolf is certainly, an important 20th century writer, so that alone probably merits her at least an entry on this list, maybe two. So it seems like based on what other people have said, that's a fair entry here to The Lighthouse. Number 44, The Sun Also Rises by Hemingway. Okay, so we do get more Hemingway. That's good. This is a good one too. I personally would pick For Whom the Bell Tolls as far as a novel goes if I was choosing my top Hemingway novel. But if we're looking for more a novel that encapsulates the like what we think of with Hemingway, quintessential lost generation 1920s Europe, I'd have to go with The Sun Also Rises, as it's more stylistic and character driven, where something like the For Whom the Bell Tolls is more plot driven. So I think that's a fair pick for this list. Number 43, The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann. Haven't read it. I know it's a classic. Truthfully, I'm a bit embarrassed, but this is the first one on this list that I don't really know much about. I remember reading about Thomas Mann. A couple of biographical details are still somewhere in my cluttered mind, but I don't really have anything to say here. So, um, other than I see this on a lot of other lists, so that kind of makes sense. Number 42, Candide. Okay, Voltaire is making a showing. I honestly didn't expect to see this one. I don't know why. It's hard to know exactly what criteria they're using, but I did not expect to see Voltaire. Now that I do see it, it kind of makes sense. It's hilarious satire. It's really a jab at Leipzig's philosophical optimism, the idea this is the best of all possible worlds that we live in. Um, Really, this novel shows that satire can be much more effective than rigorous debate. Did he mischaracterize Leipzig? Absolutely. Is Candide worth reading? Yeah, though I personally find it quite tedious as it goes along. It's like Voltaire, you already proved your point. Get on with it. But Candide is a classic. It's super, important for the Enlightenment. So definitely something that makes sense on a list like this. I would expect to see Voltaire definitely on like a top 100 nonfiction list. So that's where I said I wasn't really expecting it, but that's a fair pick. Number 41, Othello. Okay, another Shakespeare, and this is a great addition here. Iago is one of the greatest characters in literature. Harold Bloom describes him as a moral pyromaniac who wants to set fire to all reality. I think that's fair. This is a great play. The only thing is, while I agree with all of these Shakespeare inclusions so far, the order is just, I don't know. I guess everyone has strong opinions about Shakespeare. All I can say is Hamlet and King Lear better be on this list, or we're gonna have some problems. Honestly, Henry IV, if we take both parts together, definitely deserves a call on this list as well, just because of the genius of the character Falstaff alone. But yeah, so Othello, great play. So definitely deserves to be on this list. Number 40, Essays by Montaigne. Okay, so the criteria here again, I don't know. Montaigne is probably the greatest essayist of all time. These essays are, personal reflections that help define the essay form. And I would say that reading Montaigne feels like it's an amazing experience. It feels almost like you're thinking loud. There's nobody quite like Montaigne. This is another one that is so beautiful to read in the original language here, but I definitely think the criteria is a little flexible. The further we get along, the more of these that I'm a little bit surprised by. Like, okay, this is a little different than what I would have expected to be even considered for a list like this. But honestly, I'm okay with the gray zones. I don't know what you guys think so far. I think this makes sense, and it kind of shows us that what is considered literature and what is considered or fiction literature and nonfiction, it's a little bit blurry. Um, Anyways, Essays by Montaigne, fantastic, whether or not it's fiction or not. Definitely something that needs to be read if you haven't. Number 39, The Tale of Genji, often considered the first novel due to its unprecedented depth and its kind of internal character exploration. This was written by Murasaki Shikibu, a Japanese noblewoman in the Heian period, like over 1,000 years ago. And it's really interesting to read because it gives us an insight into a very different culture and time period where writings offering anything approximating internal explorations are so few and far in between. It really isn't until Cervantes, like 600 years later in Spain, that this kind of deeper exploration becomes commonplace, which is arguably a good part of the reason why we know so much more about European history and attitudes relative to other parts of the world. But this is nice to see a Japanese pick here. When you look outside of European languages, Japanese almost always has the most entries on lists like this due to their high literary output, disproportionate cultural impact, and very unique literary genres. So in many ways, this is kind of where it all started in Japan, and I think that immense impact, not just in Japan but globally as well, really gives this a good case to be included on this list. So this is a great choice in my view as well. 38, 1001 Nights. Yes, okay. This is the ultimate frame story. The premise is the king of a vast kingdom stretching from Persia to India and China kind of goes crazy when his wife commits adultery, and he makes a vow to marry a new virgin every night, execute her at dawn, and continue on every day. And this happens until the king marries a beautiful and brilliant young virgin named Scheherazade, who tells the king all these wonderful, captivating stories, ending every night at a cliffhanger to prevent her execution. This lasts for 1001 nights, then the king spares her. So this is the great, frame story. She literally ends a reign of terror through the power of story, which to me is just beautiful and profound. So, 1001 Nights contains many stories we're familiar with today, like Aladdin and the Magic Lamp, Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, and the Seven Voyages of Sinbad the Sailor, and so many more. So for the cultural impact alone, it just happens, it has to be on a list like this. And it's also deeply entertaining and captivating and magical. So that's, a plus. It reads more like a fairy tale collection with a through line, as a frame story. Very clear that this came from an oral tradition. So, yeah. I guess one more thing about this, most scholars definitely trace the origins of this at least back to Persia. So it's, like many tales stemming from, places as far as India and China and beyond. And, they're all Arabized and collected and circulated at the intellectual height of the Abbasid Caliphate. And then in the 18th century, translated into French and then English, and that's why we have them today. But they started as the fairy tales of the Middle East and into South Asia. So not really sure which version exactly this is talking about, as there are a lot, or if there really is a definitive version we can talk about. But, as a collection or a genre of tales, this is a great inclusion. Number 37 is To Kill a Mockingbird. Yes, as a culturally resonant tale, this needs to be included. If there ever was a tale that was so culturally resonant as this one, I don't know. This is a story about justice and moral development in a divided American South during the Great Depression. Great, unforgettable characters. It's got wonderful speeches and courtroom drama. It doesn't feel like moral grandstanding to me, even though many works that touch on these kind of sensitive issues can kind of fall into that trap. So I think that's part of the reason that Harper Lee's work is so impactful. I think because it tackles the prejudice from a child's perspective. It really resonates with people. Racism looks pretty ridiculous when you look at it simply and squarely from the eyes of a child. I might not have ranked this so high. For example, to put it above Macbeth seems kind of ludicrous to me, but I love this on this list. This is a great work. A smaller work than something like, Macbeth. Not as impactful, but definitely a great work. Number 36, Things Fall Apart. Yes, so this is the first novel I read by Chinua Achebe. I think it's excellent. It can be considered in the post-colonial literary tradition, and it really is, but I think it's a memorable novel because it refuses to be ideological. It really reads more as a nuanced wrestling with the collision of cultures. Achebe doesn't glorify the pre-colonial Igbo culture that, this Things Fall Apart is talking about. He presents it as having merits, but also a lot of serious, systemic, unjustifiable aspects to it, like super harsh patriarchy and cultural practices such as, the murder or abandonment of twins or children with any sort of disabilities. And he doesn't showcase the European missionaries as evil either. They do a lot of good and they have a lot of good views and intentions, but the actions and the clashes of civilization causes unintentional and intentional destruction. And it's really interesting to take a look at Nigerian history through this kind of a lens. So I totally agree with this book. This is an excellent inclusion on this list. And yeah, so enough said about that. Now we enter the dreamscape here with number 35, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. And I would include Alice Through the Looking Glass here as well, as some of the famous stories from Alice's adventures are like her encounter with Tweedledee and Tweedledum, and even like the Jabberwocky poem. Those come from the sequel and not the original. So But if we have to choose one, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, of course, is the more impactful one. And it deserves a place here because the satire is great, but there's also a lot of great insight into humanity and life through the juxtaposition of the nonsense world that Alice encounters with our knowledge of how bizarre the world we live in sometimes appears. So, wonderfully bizarre pick here. Number 34 is Jane Eyre, another one I've spoken about a lot. So, a lot of people have told me this is their favorite story. This is a great inclusion on a list like this. It's a transformational gothic coming of age story about love and duty, independence and responsibility and morality versus desire. So, number 34 as Jane Eyre seems very appropriate. Number 33, The Red and the Black, or Le Rouge et le Noir by Stendhal, is one that I have not read, much to my chagrin, but it's certainly spoken about enough to make its inclusion here unsurprising. Fun fact about Stendhal is that he was a relative unknown during his lifetime, and his great works, which are now considered masterpieces, were mostly published after he died posthumously. So I always feel a certain tragic depth in artists whose work only comes to light after they die, after they leave this world. So yeah, anyways, The Red and the Black by Stendhal 33, that makes sense. Speaking of tragedy, this might be the greatest tragedy of all time that isn't Hamlet or Oedipus Rex. And can you guess? Yes, it's the tragedy of King Lear by the Bard again. I love how much Shakespeare's on this list. Sometimes we lump all of his works together as one, but I think separating them demonstrates just how big and varied of an impact he really has had on literature and on the English language. Anyways, King Lear is definitely considered a top three Shakespeare play by the majority of scholars, maybe top five, and also by lovers of Shakespeare. This is probably the most emotionally destructive, overwhelming work of English literature, or probably any literature ever written. It explores love and betrayal and madness. It explores truth, justice, the consequences of blindness and moral failings. It's so human. Shakespeare is so human, and for that reason alone, man, he needs to be on this list, and this needs to be on this list. I often reflect upon something a professor at Oxford said to me, that Hamlet is the most compelling Shakespeare play when you're young. But as you grow older, you kind of find yourself coming back more and more to King Lear. So maybe I'm still in the Hamlet phase, because I'm not going to lie, Hamlet is, I think, in my opinion, at this point, Shakespeare's greatest play. But the truth is, King Lear is an absolute masterpiece, and it's an essential member on this list. It should be higher, but it's a lot to read emotionally. So I probably won't reread this one for a while myself, and I won't necessarily tell you you have to reread it either or read it, but this is definitely one that should be considered one of the most important and impactful works of literature of all time. Number 30 here is Catcher in the Rye. So this one is controversial. I know this one's going to be controversial. My personal view is, due to the uniqueness of the narrative voice alone, this probably should be on this list. For those that are going to say, but his voice is so grating and annoying, note I said uniqueness. I didn't say, enjoyability or pleasure of reading Holden Caulfield's voice. I mean, truthfully, I am a bit of a sucker for neurotic 20th and early 21st century coming of age stories, but even my thoughts aside, this book has had a huge impact, and that alone should put it on this list. What we can say about this is that it definitely is influenced by post-war existentialism. I wonder if Camus will be on this list as well. I think L'Étranger or The Stranger would be a good addition in terms of impact. And other books like this, The Moviegoer is another great lost young person type narrative. I think it's less aggressively contrarian for the sake of being contrarian, which is how I read Holden. And I think it's a valid critique of him as a character. What Walker Percy calls the search is more what the moviegoer is about. It's less about, fighting, authority, and then more about search. And so I think most people have, or more people have a search phase than a rebellion phase, but both exist. So, anyways, I like this pick here, but I would have ranked it lower on this list, not because it's bad. I just think there are so many other ones that we've already looked at that are better and more impactful, and there are bound to be others, based on the ones that I know that must be included here. So now we're in the top 30. Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. I need to read more Conrad before I can say definitively that this is his best work, but it's hugely impactful, and I think it's wonderfully rich and thought-provoking, even though it's so brief. It's just so, I don't know, it's so thought-provoking. So it really is, both in terms of narrative structure and themes and writing style, a journey into the heart of the jungle, the heart of colonial exploitation, the heart of, you know, psychological collapse. And so I think the way things become more ambiguous the deeper we go on this journey is a big part of the reason this hits. But this is a great pick here. Number 29, Middlemarch. So I started reading this one 3 years ago, and I love the prose and the characters and the story, but for some reason I did not finish it. I think I just got reading some other books, and honestly, I don't have a good reason for not finishing it. I definitely plan to go back and read this properly. In terms of feel, maybe we can compare this to kind of like Anna Karenina, and in terms of scope, it feels much more like a Jane Eyre in terms of virtuous themes, and it maybe more like a lot of these other styles, books, that are impactful. I can see how it's in that vein, at least based on my initial impression, having read only a portion of it. And look, I like George Eliot a lot. I've listened to several lectures on her writing, philosophy, life, and works, and also some of the, in-depth studies on this book in particular. So, man, I need to finish this book. I've read more about this book than I have actually read it, which is embarrassing, but this novel is often called one of the most complete social novels ever written because it's got, multiple lives and ambitions and moral choices, and they all interconnect in this single community. So just because of impact, because of my initial impressions, enjoyability, I'll say that this seems like a fair place to put this one. Number 28, we have Wuthering Heights. Yes, as I've mentioned before, this is a novel often framed as a romance, but is really about obsession and cruelty and emotional manipulation taken way too far, and it is never made into good films, so don't watch the films, read the book if you do want to experience this novel. I think it absolutely deserves to be here, but I'm also a little surprised at how high this ranks, especially given the quality of the list so far. Don't get me wrong, this is good, but I don't think this is the best Bronte book. Jane Eyre is superior in terms of morals, in terms of story and impact, and in my view, it's just a better book. So, yeah, so I can't justify this being so high, but definitely should be on this list. Number 27, The Canterbury Tales. Okay, so this one is not surprising at all, given the impact alone. Another classic frame story, a group of pilgrims traveling to Canterbury. This is probably the most important collection of stories that help to define English literature itself. Probably this is the most outsized impact of literature in the Middle English, written in Middle English, right? If Beowulf founded the canon for Old English, Beowulf should definitely be on this list too. I wonder if we'll see that. And Shakespeare marks the transition to modern English with psychological and humanist storytelling styles that we're familiar with. This is kind of that connection between the epic poem and the modern story. So gender dynamics are so interesting in The Wife of Bath's tale in this story. The Miller's Tale is quite funny. The Knight's Tale is a classic that opens as well. So you can honestly read any of these stories in isolation, just like A Thousand and One Nights or Grimm's Fairy Tales. I wonder if that one will be on here as well. I like this pick here, no surprise. Next up, this is one of the best novels I have ever read. Definitely a personal top 20 for me. They have it here at number 26. This is East of Eden by John Steinbeck. Set in the Salinas Valley, East of Eden is a beautifully written, sprawling novel. It really is an allegorical novel that reimagines the basic biblical story of Cain and Abel, stretch out across multiple generations, brilliantly and interestingly exploring themes like good and evil, free will and responsibility, and the need for love and the kind of breakdowns that ensue when that love is denied. This narrative follows the intertwining of two families, the Trasks and the Hamiltons, and the characters in this novel are really amazing. Cal, kind of the second Cain figure of a series of generations. Lee, really the heart and moral center of the novel. Samuel, the wise and honest patriarch. Kathy, the personification of evil. There are so many great characters and so many great ideas, like Tim Shell, exploring the Hebrew roots of the idea "thou mayest," triumph over evil from part of the passage. But we won't go too deep into all of those themes. They'll probably require a video of its own. There's so many beautiful passages in Steinbeck, whether it's a landscape description or internal character development. Steinbeck can write. So I'm glad they put East of Eden here and, not say The Grapes of Wrath, because this is Steinbeck's best novel by a long shot. He's a great writer no matter what novel you read, and he tells important stories, whether it's Mice of Men and Grapes of Wrath, The Pearl, Cannery Row, or whatever. But East of Eden is it's so morally nuanced, and explores the perpetual human battle between good and evil in every heart in such a compelling way. It's so interesting. This is a great story. So that is number 26. East of Eden by John Steinbeck. Now we're at to the top 25. This next one is A Tale Told by an Idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. The Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner. So the title, of course, is drawn from William Shakespeare's play Macbeth, which we've already discussed. This one is interesting. I suspect most people admire Faulkner, but don't necessarily always enjoy reading his work. Some people definitely do. It's Faulkner, so it's going to be structurally difficult. This one has fractured time, shifting perspectives, unreliable narration, a lot of very convoluted sentences. But Faulkner definitely deserves to be on this list, probably with multiple entries. I wonder if we will get another one. We did. We got Absalom. Yeah, so that, definitely makes sense. So I like this pick. I need to read more Faulkner before I can speculate as to which of his works exactly is the best and which should be included and ranked in what order. But both as a short story writer and a novelist, he's one of the greatest, so this makes sense here. Number 24, Stories by Kafka featuring the Metamorphosis. Okay, so again, unclear exactly where the lines are drawn here, but I don't know which stories specifically we're talking about, but to simplify, let's just assume this is all of Kafka's short fiction, so excluding, say, The Castle and The Trial, but including works like The Metamorphosis, Hunger Artist, Penal Colony, and whatnot. Look, it's hard to overestimate Kafka's influence. We even have a term based on his name, Kafkaesque, right? To describe a bizarre, nightmarish kind of bureaucratic system. So, unfortunately, as he was a perfectionist, Kafka published very little in his life, but fortunately he did have a friend who published most of his long works and many of his short stories after his death, going against his explicit wishes that they all be destroyed. If you ever get the chance to visit Prague, definitely visit the Kafka Museum. It's right across the river from the Old Town. It's well worth the visit. I have so much more to say about Kafka, and the Metamorphosis in particular really is a special story, but I'll be brief because, we got a lot more to get through. But the Metamorphosis basically, it follows an absurd, surreal transformation of this young businessman named Gregor Samsa as he wakes up and finds himself turned into an insect. And, in part, this reads as a critique of dehumanizing work culture and social pressures, but also the conditionality of family love. This is worth reading. It has a huge impact, and its inclusion here makes perfect sense to me. So number 23 is one of the great satires of all time, Gulliver's Travels by the brilliant Jonathan Swift. Swift takes a popular 18th century travels tale format kind of idea, and he introduces Gulliver as if he's a real ship captain, and plausibly gives you his background, his birth, his credentials, and then we get to the 4-part tale, which gets increasingly ridiculous. And we do know from historical accounts there were some people who, the word gullible, right? Like they definitely did fall for this, but it is pretty crazy to think when you read through this that anyone could have taken this seriously. Gulliver famously visits 4 strange lands. First, an island inhabited by little people, like tiny people. Then he goes to this land with giants. Then he arrives at this floating island full of all these weird people that are obsessed with like math and philosophy, but they're super theoretical and they don't, do anything. And finally, he goes to this society of intelligent horses and these filthy creatures called yahoos, which are really just kind of like um, these really base humans. So it's a fun story, but of course, it's really a satire of 18th century British politics. It really is a satire of Whigs' political policies and pettiness and perceived lack of meritocracy at the time from Swift's perspective. But it's pretty dark, honestly. Then again, Swift is the guy who wrote A Modest Proposal, which suggests that the impoverished Irish could basically stop being poor if they would just sell their excess children as food for the wealthy. So, we definitely go into reading Swift expecting dark comedy, but this deserves a place here. Um, Probably would have ranked it a bit lower, but definitely on the list. Number 22, the Aeneid. Okay, Virgil. Yeah, this definitely needs to be one on this list. The Aeneid is really Rome building its identity through this binding narrative. So for that reason alone, it's foundational. What the Torah is the national story of the Jews, and the Odyssey and the Iliad are like the national story of the ancient Greeks. The Aeneid provides this divine historical founding myth and national ethos for Rome. And Rome provides a part of the historical founding myth and national ethos of the West. So this is really an essential classic for that reason alone. But the Aeneid definitely needs to be on a list here, no questions there. Next, speak of the Greek, we have number 21, Oedipus the King. Okay, this is one of the most crazy tragedies ever written. It's also it's so uncomfortable. The Greek obsession with the inevitability of fate is on full display here. The prophecy at the beginning of the story is you will murder your father and marry your mother. And in order to avoid this at great lengths, unintentionally, both of those things come to pass. So that's basically the premise. Sophocles is a genius. It's tragic that the Library of Alexandria was burned and so many other historic upheavals in the ancient world prevented us from having access to more Greek plays. We've lost the vast majority of Greek drama. Probably only about 3% or so of it remains with us today. So, even when we're ranking the greatest works, these are the greatest works we still know about, we still have access to. Regardless, this is one that has fortunately not been lost, and I think its inclusion on this list ensures it will remain with us for many generations to come. Now, the top 20. This is what you guys have all been waiting for. Number 20, Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. This is not The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells, although I like that book as well. I'm surprised no Wells or Verne made it to this list so far. I would have expected, at the impact level that they had, in science fiction and whatnot, is super important. I happen to think that sci-fi and fantasy are genres that are unfairly overlooked by classic literature enthusiasts a lot of times. They're pretty interesting and worth exploring. And, I think they're worth continuing to remember, in my view at least. But anyways, that's not why we're here. Ralph Ellison, I made a video about this last week. So this is one that I have, very clearly in my mind what it's about, basically an exploration of identity and invisibility in society. However, I have not read this one, so I don't know if it lives up to the hype or not. It's definitely much talked about for what that's worth, but based on where some of these other lists have been, my guess is that unless I'm really surprised, this definitely is pretty high on this list for what it should be. I'm sure it's a great book. It probably should be included on a list like this, but at number 20, I'm skeptical. Anyways, number 19, The Trial. Okay, good. We got another Kafka, and this is the exact one I was expecting and hoping to see. I'm a little more comfortable with this ranking at 20 than I would be than with Invisible Man, for example. It's an absurdist dystopian story where this bank clerk named Joseph K is arrested and prosecuted, and he's never told what his crime is. So it's wonderfully Kafkaesque, in the way that bureaucracy just becomes this existential horror. It's really one of those books that is uncomfortable to read, but I think it's important for us to read The Trial if we want to remain human. One more thing about Kafka that I would be remiss not to touch upon to this end is just how uncannily prophetic his work was when it comes to the ideas of dehumanizing bureaucratic and totalitarian systems. Think about the Nazi and Soviet regimes that came to power in the decades following his death of the 1920s, right? It's prophetic of those. I'm not sure how intentional it was, but it's easy to forget that he was writing before the First World War and into the 1920s. It feels like he was writing, this in like the 50s or 60s or something. And either way, I mean, reading Kafka allows us to descend into the totalitarian tyranny of bureaucracy and dehumanization, which I feel is even more important for us to do in the AI age when we really, have the potential to see great things, but also the potential to really dehumanize it in the way we saw in the communist and fascist regimes of the 20th century. So anyways, if you ever hate being in a TSA line or, waiting for, like airport security or tyranny or something like that, Kafka shows you that's the beginning of really bad things. But anyways, maybe I just don't like those. Speaking of deep novels, though, that are psychologically rich and character forming, number 18 is The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. So I'm not surprised to see this one here. Yeah, this is good for good reason on a list like this. I'll have to keep this one brief because there's a lot to say about Dostoevsky. One could call Dostoevsky the first literary psychologist. He had a significant influence on Nietzsche and Freud, and as I discovered earlier today, actually quite an influence on Einstein as well, but he really is masterful in his analysis of the human psyche. The Brothers Karamazov is really one of his two most important works, and although there is nothing wrong with the plot, a father is, murdered, and one of his sons is on trial for the murder, and then all three of his sons are wrestling with ideas relating to God, morality, mortality, and the human responsibility. Um, so that's a great plot, right? But Dostoevsky uses the family as a kind of testing ground for belief itself. Each son is an archetype of types. Dmitri, the oldest son, he's kind of this passionate and reckless character. He's also the one on trial. Ivan is the middle son, and he's brilliant but skeptical and plagued by all these existential doubts. And most famously, this deep concern that if God does not exist, which he comes to believe to an extent, then everything is permitted, and the implications of this are terrifying. And then the youngest son, Alyosha, the spiritual one who kind of acts as a moral compass or a spiritual center of the story. So it's a beautiful novel, very deep and rich and dense and psychologically resonant, even if it does take a little bit to get into this novel and the philosophy and spiritual themes alone, are challenging. All of this, I think, earns it a place on the top 20. So that makes sense. Perfect. We have the psychologist's other masterpiece at number 17 here, Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. So, that's a good question. Which one's better, Crime and Punishment? They're both very similar, like in ranking. I think this is a fair place to rank both of them kind of around the same, the mid-teens or maybe into the 20s. That seems really accurate. I'm happy with that. This is a good list so far. Okay, what can we say about Crime and Punishment? The thing that surprised me about this novel is how fresh it felt after reading The Brothers Karamazov, which I read first. It does touch on some of the same ideas, but it explores largely different themes, and to me, it's most notable for its individual psychological depth. Well, The Brothers Karamazov kind of compares and contrasts different life philosophies and follows the theoretical implications of living them out. Crime and Punishment puts a simple moral compromise into action, into practice. Well, The Brothers Karamazov considers the whole foundation of what we might call, Western morality. Crime and Punishment considers what happens if we remove just one brick, one simple block from the foundations. In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov is an impoverished student, or he's just stopped being a student in St. Petersburg, and he murders an unlikable pawnbroker to test his theory that the Napoleon kind of way of thinking, Napoleonic people, there are bigger men that can sacrifice other men for larger aims. Any quote-unquote superior individual can transcend moral law for the greater good. And he justifies his action creatively with all sorts of, she's not a likable person, and I can use this money for better reasons, or whatever his justification is. But he's ultimately plagued by extreme guilt, paranoia, alienation. And this is an extraordinarily interior book that is just a tour de force, well worth reading. Number 16, okay, we're moving on here. We have to go from the 19th century Russia now to America in the Jazz Age with The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. So, this book is beautifully written. I used to say, if only I could write sentences like Fitzgerald or Steinbeck. I love the structure of this novel too. We're introduced to a cast of captivating, decadent, and generally empty characters through this kind of bland and unreliable narrator who's a Midwesterner named Nick Carraway. Now, this novel is centered around its namesake, who is a mysterious millionaire named Jay Gatsby, and he is deeply and obsessively in love with a very shallow and careless woman, socialite, who happens to be married and happens to be Nick's cousin. In many ways, this book is partially a commentary on America and the American dream, which is portrayed as a kind of corrupted, unattainable illusion, a green light across the bay, so close yet always out of reach. It's the rags to riches story that can never last because it's built on illusions. The Great Gatsby takes a look at hedonism and materialism and the moral emptiness of the glitz and glamour of the Jazz Age, and yet it's not a simple cautionary tale. You get the sense in reading it that Fitzgerald wants it all to be true, but that he just can't quite see a way through. So this is a good book. I'm really happy this made the list. Yeah. Next up here we have Jane Austen at number 15 with Pride and Prejudice. You know, this is a good pick. It's a classic romance. Follows the eventful relationship between the intelligent and spirited Elizabeth Bennet and her off and on suitor, the rich aristocrat, Mr. Darcy. Jane Austen is one of the greatest writers. She's so good. I'm just thinking which novel I would have placed, but this is a good one. I love the setting of Austen. You know, it's set in Regency England, which is wonderful, as many other classic romances that we've seen on this list and we'll probably see more. You know, they come from later periods, Victorian, Edwardian, so it's nice to see this kind of earlier England. And it's a wonderfully virtuous novel, very Aristotelian and traditional, to say rooted in classic virtues like constancy and amiability. I think Austen has enough literary merit to justify this spot alone, just as a writer. But when you factor in how life-affirming her writing is and how she strives to demonstrate this kind of path to the good life through moral excellence, in my view, that's enough to put her into the top 20 or even the top 10. Honestly, I'm surprised it took so long for us to get to Jane Austen. I would have thought you would be at least 3 entries on this list, like Sense and Sensibility and Persuasion, probably lower down. But all in all, Austen probably is one of the greatest 10 writers of all time, and Pride and Prejudice definitely deserves to be on this list. Sense and Sensibility needs to be on this list too, though. So good. Anyways, that's a good pick. Fair. Maybe a little higher in my opinion, but fair. Now, at number 14, we have Midnight's Children by Salman Rushdie. Okay. This one feels quite out of place, to be honest. I'm not really sure why this is here, especially as it's so high on this list. I personally would think if one work by Salman Rushdie would be here, it would have been the Satanic Verses. As you know, from my perspective, this has had more cultural impact and influence, what with the fatwa that was issued against him and whatnot. Although I suppose this is arguably the novel that most thoroughly explores and fictionalizes the modern state of India. So maybe it's included as a sort of kind of like divine and historic founding myth, like the Aeneid, but for India, modern India. I don't know. I still don't love this pick here, but you know, maybe I do need to revisit Midnight's Children. It's not a bad book, do not get me wrong, but it's just like in the top 15, above Jane Austen, above Macbeth. I don't know. Yeah, so this is one of the most controversial picks from my perspective. I definitely needs to be lower. Maybe not even on this list, or if it is, lower on this list. Okay, number 13. The clocks were striking 13, and at 13 we have 1984. That is a hilarious coincidence that the opening line of 1984 corresponds with its number on this list. So maybe that's all we need to say about that. It's divine orchestration. I'm just kidding. So this is a fair place for this book, I think. Maybe it could be a bit lower, but it's here for a reason. Everybody talks about 1984, even if they haven't read it, right? This book really is excellent as well. It's not just a dystopian world. It gave us many words and phrases that we use to describe and to recognize totalitarianism. Terms like surveillance state, mind control, and manipulated truth. You bring to mind 1984, but even explicitly the terms that come from the novel, like Big Brother or doublethink or thought crime, that are now in the English language, it's so influential. This is a great dystopian work, arguably the best, though there are a few contenders I would have liked to see on this list as well. We saw one other, in Brave New World, which is good. Ultimately, this is another one which has had a cultural impact alone that makes it impossible to exclude. So I concur with number 13 as 1984. Number 12, Madame Bovary by Flaubert. This I haven't read. I see it a lot on such lists. I know it's known as a pioneering book in literary realism, but the real reason this is on this list is simply to appease the French. There is no other reason I can even imagine why this would be on this list. No, I'm just kidding. This book does seem to have a lot of merit for a list like this, and I look forward to reading it one day. Number 12 is Madame Bovary. In 11th place, we're visiting Denmark. Okay, good. Redemption, right? To be or not to be in the top 10, that is the question. This should definitely be in the top 10. I'm struggling to think of many works that can outrank Hamlet by William Shakespeare, It's it probably should be number 1 or number 2, right? It's definitely not number 11, but regardless, this is arguably Shakespeare's magnum opus, and Shakespeare is probably the Western tradition's magnum opus, if you could say that. So this could easily be number 1, and I'd be happy, right? But number 11 is, I guess, it's top 12. That's okay. A work like this. Well, there is no work like this. This work is unlike anything you will ever read. The psychological depth, the brilliant wordplay, the sheer humanness of Hamlet. This play invites us to interpret and reinterpret the most interesting and important universal themes like, mortality and existential dread, and revenge, and many other I'm forgetting or yet to discover. And he does all of this extremely tactfully. A work that successfully wrestles with even one of these ideas, I think, can be rightly considered a classic, maybe a top 100 classic. Hamlet contains within 4 hours the genius of Goethe, the psychological depth of Dostoevsky, the wittiness of Oscar Wilde, and the surrealism of Kafka, and the writing brilliance of Austen, and somehow so much more, and pulls it off. And so my only criticism is that Hamlet contains too much, that it perpetually feels like it's about to explode or else implode into nothingness and take you with it. So it's worth reading, but reader beware. Okay, we've made it to the top 10 now. These are the 10 greatest works of literature ever written. And at number 10, we have the Iliad. This is one of the 2 major Greek epic poems attributed to Homer, and is likely one, if not the oldest work of literature still widely read today. This fits at this kind of fits the, what do you call it? The building stone or the cornerstone of the foundation stone of so much that comes after it. Even though it doesn't necessarily give us a psychological window into the characters' inner lives like modern novels do, the heroic stature of the characters in the Iliad is so compelling. Hector, Odysseus, Achilles, it's moving, it's brutal, it captures war, the desire for honor, the consequences of rage, and the nature of mortality, gods versus men, in a way that leaves you with a distinct sense of the world as conceptualized by the heroic Greeks. So of course this is here because it's influential, but even beyond its influence, it holds up as a very powerful narrative here. So this is a great pick. Number 9, a bit more of a controversial pick, I think. We have The Stranger by Camus. I was wondering if we would get this one on this list, and I like this for this list, but frankly, I think putting The Stranger at number 9 above Hamlet is ridiculous. I wouldn't even put this in the top 40. I do think this is an important book. It just feels really out of place here. If I had to steelman this placement, I'd probably say it's here because it's a great distillation of existentialism into something accessible and readable. Um, it's a really short book, and it really understands a influential philosophy that, at least in the last couple of decades, has been very common. It's maybe less so now, I don't know. But during the period when all these lists were compiled, the normativity of existentialism was high. Some of those reasons might be part of the reasons why this is so high on the list. I find the emotional detachment of the main character to be interesting. The opening line is, my mom died today, or maybe yesterday. I don't know. Something like that. It forces you to confront the existential questions head on. Um, Look, I think, like I said, I think this is probably here because if you need this novel, it probably scratches the itch very well. And I imagine this could easily become an all-time favorite novel for a very small number of people who care a lot about it and want to tell everyone about it, and something that the majority of people that are they're kind of indifferent about. So this can skew results, and this is something we also need to consider on lists like this, is the 1% effect, right? If a small, highly passionate group of people feel very strongly about something, they can dictate the narrative in many cases. So if 1% of people really are opposed to a new building being put in and it would benefit 90% of people, is that building going to be put in that community? Probably not, because that 1% is going to be more vocal than the 90% who would marginally benefit from it. The same can be true about literature. I'm trying to understand this here, okay? L'étranger, The Stranger, is very strange, in its placement in the top 10 here. It's certainly an important post-war novel. Camus writes well, but by no means should this be in the top 10. Anyways, moving swiftly along, Ulysses by James Joyce. Yes, I figured this would be on this list, and about this high too. Ulysses is very famous for a number of reasons. Um, this deserves to be probably in the top 10. This is not surprising. Let's put it that way. I've got some thoughts I'm kind of going back and forth about, but this is one that is wonderfully fresh, modern, um, eh, kind of take on the Odyssey or the Aeneid, right? Or the classic tales, right? The chapters are titled based on events from the journey, right? There's headings like Cyclops or Hades or Penelope, and another thing is it's super experimental. Like it's not a retelling. I should clarify. This is not a retelling of the Odyssey. It's about a man who walks around Dublin for a day, and a woman who has an affair on her husband, and a couple of other things. That's what it's about. But what is it really about? It's an experimental novel. That's why it's on this list. It's not on this list because of the plot, right? And it's not the experimenting of a madman either, or a hack writer. It's the experimenting of one of the greatest and most well-read multilingual literary minds in human history, pushing the limits of experimentation. It showcases a stream of consciousness style in one chapter and writes another chapter like a play. And, one section that is light and pompous might be followed by another reflective, moody, very, verbose section. So yet another reason why this is included so high here is that if it is not the essential work of literary modernism, it is certainly one of them, right? So putting aside readability, how many people have actually read this book, other factors that may have been used for inclusion for a lot of other books, Ulysses is here for innovativeness alone, and that I think justifies its being so high on this list, I think. But I'm kind of contradicting myself a tiny bit in the sense that I just said with The Stranger, a small percentage of people absolutely love this book, and I don't think that justifies it being ranked so high. That's the reason why Ulysses is ranked so high, though. And yet, I kind of feel like it does justify it in the case of Ulysses, for some of the reasons I explained. But maybe that's also just a personal view. So maybe you could make the same argument for The Stranger versus Ulysses. But anyways, I'm curious, whether you've read Ulysses or a part of Ulysses or just heard about it, why do you think it deserves to be included here or doesn't? Because this is another one that's very interesting. Next up here, we have another big one, War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. So this one could feel intimidating too. It's about the big events of history and the small but powerful lives of the humans who live through them. There aren't really any main characters or main plot. but it's just the way he writes is unlike anything, right? It's more of an extended tapestry of lives and events, real and fictional alike. They interspersed with deep questions on philosophy and morality, and a bit of Tolstoy's personal views. Perhaps this is most notable with the big tangent where he goes on about the great men versus the tides and forces of history, which is a question I personally find fascinating, but maybe some people find, tedious as well. It's possible. You know, what can I say about this? I think that because of how this novel is formatted with its vast historical scope and its varied thematic passages, it feels like reading a series of stories and novels tied together. So perhaps, you know, perhaps that's why this is more than just any novel. This is like many novels. And I know when Tolstoy was writing this, he set off to write a short story set decades after the events that he actually wrote about. Um, it takes place, during the Napoleonic Wars and before and after as well, and over, different. It's not just one period of time, right? It goes through different periods of time. So, anyways, there's so much more to say about War and Peace. This is definitely one that I think justifies being so high on this list here. As I mentioned with Middlemarch, there's very few books which I started, then super enjoyed and abandoned partway in. War and Peace is one that I have not actually finished the whole book, partly because it feels like so many different books that you're reading. Um, you know, it's one that I'm really looking forward to diving back into and getting all the way through. It's gripping and well written, at least the part I read, and this massive cast of characters can definitely be overwhelming at times, but top 10? I think so. At number 6, we have Moby Dick. Okay. Herman Melville, Call Me Ishmael, from the opening line on, Moby Dick is just iconic, man. This is a really good one. On the surface, this is a story about an obsessed whaling captain named Ahab on a vendetta to hunt the legendary white whale Moby Dick, who bit his leg off, but it goes so much deeper than that, right? It's got so many wonderful themes about explorations of fate versus free will in the primordial battle between humanity and the untamed world. I did a whole video on why you should read Moby Dick, where I go more into depth on things like the narrators philosophizing, the whaling and zoology and law and other tangents and the biblical references and allusions, and all of those are just so fascinating. But look, Moby Dick is arguably one of the very few contenders for the great American novel. If such a title can really ever be bestowed on a novel or on a work, something like The Scarlet Letter, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and this one probably are, the biggest contenders for the iconic American, greatest American book ever written. This is iconically American, I would say, and it's wonderful. I'm surprised that The Scarlet Letter and Huck Finn and probably also Tom Sawyer haven't shown up on this list, as far as I remember. It's very bizarre to me. There's a few omissions for sure so far that we're getting to the top 5. So I know that we're not going to get all of them on this list, but I was not surprised at all by this choice. I more or less agree with it. And so I think that's a fair place for Moby Dick. And now we've made it to the top 5. The 5th greatest book ever written, according to the internet, is Proust, In Search of Lost Time. This is sometimes called Remembrance of Things Past, but from the French, À la recherche du temps perdu, In Search of Lost Time is more literally accurate. And literarily accurate, we'll see. They can make an argument either way, but In Search of Lost Time is definitely Marcel Proust's masterpiece. It's over 3,000 pages, it's 7 volumes, it has no obvious plot, so why should you read this, right? Why is this the 5th greatest book of all time? It's definitely up there with Ulysses as a critically acclaimed but inaccessible novel. In it, Proust explores how time is experienced by stretching these small moments into something vast, like taste and smell. They're beautifully described and they're able to transport you through the words, through the descriptions, if you let them, into Proust's wonderfully sensitive and sensory imagination. Alain de Botton wrote a short book called How Proust Can Change Your Life that explores what Proust does why he is so important, and more. If you're interested in reading a book like this, like In Search of Lost Time, I highly recommend reading something first like How Proust Can Change Your Life, so you can really see if this is the right fit, because this is a big commitment to read. The other side of this is you can read a part of this. It's 7 volumes, and Swan's Way is the most famous. So don't read this and feel that simply because this is one of the greatest works of all time, there's an obligation to finish. You should read this because it's enjoyable. I think I understand why this is on this list. It's partly because of how much we talk about it, how much critics love it, but Proust did something that nobody else has done. Like Joyce did something that nobody else has done, and Tolstoy did something that nobody else has done. And for those reasons, I think all of those writers are often in the top tens, and in my opinion, deserve, at least there's a good argument that they deserve those spots. Okay, now number 4 is the Odyssey. So that's correct. We, another one that I have here actually, the Odyssey, one that I was talking about, I guess, previously. But seeing as we already spoke a good deal about the other Greek epic poem attributed to Homer, the Iliad, let me just say I agree with this placement. This belongs here for a lot of reasons. One is because there's Cyclopses in it. No, the real reason is because it really defines the journey narrative that shows up so much in literature throughout the years. Odysseus is such a great hero. You know, he's heroic, he's cunning. He's definitely depicted a lot more favorably as Odysseus is here in this Latin portrayal than his. Sorry, he's depicted a lot more graciously as Odysseus than he would be in his Latin depiction as Ulysses. That's what I was trying to say. So he is also the basis for Ulysses, which is, of course, the character in the Aeneid. But and he's a lot more cruel in the Aeneid. It's just deceitful and mean and whatnot. So, anyways, the basic plot of here in the Odyssey is Odysseus is on this 10-year journey home to Ithaca after the Trojan War. And then in the second part, after he's returned, he has to restore his kingdom and his wife and get rid of these vulture-like suitors that have been trying to take his kingdom from him while he was gone. So at the end of the day, either the Odyssey or the Iliad or both of them really should be in the top 10 for sure, just because of historical impact alone. But they're also great stories, and so yeah, I have no problem with either of those lists here. Now we're in the top 3. In third place, we have Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. Man, I remember the first time I read this book. This book really is impactful. I've spoken about it before, but Anna Karenina is one of the most complete and moving tragedies ever put to paper. It follows the beautiful young Anna Karenina, who feels trapped in this loveless marriage and embarks upon an affair she can't sustain. But Tolstoy doesn't just tell a story of adultery, he explores the unraveling of Anna's soul and other characters' souls around her as well. It's set in a society that is both rigid and hypocritical. I think part of what makes this novel such a great entry is that it's so believable. Every choice, every consequence, as wrong or as devastating as they might be, they feel honest. I think even other great classic novels generally struggle with not overacting a bit, if you will. But Tolstoy never does that. This really is a great book. It might be a controversial pick to put Anna Karenina above War and Peace, but I don't think it's a ridiculous placement or anything. I can't personally justify it as number 3, but certainly very reasonable top 10 or top 20 at least pick. So that's fair. In the number 2 spot here, we have an indisputable literary masterpiece, the one and only Divine Comedy by Dante. Well, abandon all hope, ye who enter here, because we are going to number 2, which is the Inferno, Purgatorio, and then Paradiso. But the Divine Comedy is certainly unlike anything ever written, right? Its historic impact is remarkable. It's still widely studied and debated, and it's so deep. I would say this is one of the most ambitious literary works ever written. It's an epic poem that journeys through hell, purgatory, and paradise, and it's a fictionalized version of Dante, who is guided first by Virgil through hell, essentially, or the 9 concentric circles of the Inferno, and then by Beatrice through Purgatorio and Paradiso, who is kind of based on a woman that Dante loved. Now, on one level, this is Dante's allegory for the soul's ascent to God, and it's beautiful, though it can definitely be harsh and difficult at times. It was written in Italian to allow for a wider audience, which was a huge innovation at the time, and probably part of the reason that this is still talked about so much. However, this is much more than just an allegory, right? This is a deep critique of Dante's political and religious opponents at the time that they were living, right? The poem is profound, though at times it can be very funny as well. Dante definitely has some interesting perpetual tortures in the Inferno for some of his political opponents, so I guess some things never change. But but anyways, he was a devout Catholic, and the allegory is influenced by those beliefs. But no matter what you personally feel, this is definitely one of the greatest works of world literature of all time, certainly worth reading. I can see this placement. And the greatest fiction book of all time is none other than the dreamer of impossible dreams, the fighter of unbeatable foes, the one and only man of La Mancha, Don Quixote by Cervantes. This is one of the greatest works in world literature and often considered the first modern novel. It's hilarious, it's insightful, it inspired a great musical. It is also the best-selling novel of all time, having sold over 500 million copies. Don Quixote also had a massive influence on the Spanish language. With Cervantes kind of functioning for Spanish, similarly to how Shakespeare functions for English, it really unified a fractured landscape of dialects when Cervantes published this, right? Similar to what you could find in Italy, for example, until very recently. That's what you saw in Spain. And then it solidified them into a standard, accessible language, cementing numerous idioms, such as, from mostly drawn from things that Cervantes says in his book. And so sometimes Spanish is called la lengua de Cervantes. That's another idiom, for example. Now, Cervantes has a remarkable biography too. In addition to being one of the most important writers of all time, he was a soldier, a convict, a tax collector, and for 5 years, a slave by Arab pirates. So, I think this is a fitting way to end the list. The first novel remaining the best, or the first modern novel, Don Quixote, a man of La Mancha. There you have it. So that's the list. It's interesting. I still can't quite figure out exactly what criteria for inclusion we used, but I actually really like this list for what it's worth. With a couple of exceptions, all of the works on this list that I've read were excellent, thought-provoking, interesting, impactful. I don't think there's really any exceptions. The ones I haven't read, I have at least heard a good deal about them, right? And these are definitely much talked about books in the literary zeitgeist. So I do think that each book on this list has quite a bit of depth. So good job, Internet, on making the list to that extent. The biggest thing for me here was that there was definitely a lot of books that, should have been ranked lower or should have been ranked higher. The exact order I was not so much always a fan of. And there's a lot of other books that should have been included. But, if we included all of them, then the list would be longer, and I don't think we could ever make a list that I would be completely happy with. So overall, we did a pretty good job, all things considered. So, I think that this list had a good balance between books of popular appeal, historical impact, scholarly merit, uniqueness, and enjoyability, and thought-provoking list. This was a very thought-provoking list to respond to, so I think it was good. Given any single criteria to consider, this list really falls flat, but looking at all of them together, subjectively, at a certain angle, kind of makes sense, right? Through merit, through history, through a complex myriad of factors, these have become the books we talk about. The ones that, what this list will tell us is these are the books that we constantly mediate on, we remember. But reflecting upon many reasons we have to remember, it strikes me that some are more virtuous and valuable than others. Nevertheless, if some of these books are remembered for less than ideal reasons, of it doesn't really matter because they all resonate with some aspect of the human experience and are all part of what makes us really humans. And that's what it's all about, these kind of lists. At the end of the day, we do need to remember books, important books, transformational and impactful and culturally defining and civilizationally significant books. But why this and not that can be a really hard question to answer. Reading is in part a collective experience. We recommend books, we talk books, we lean on others to decide what to read at times of uncertainty, hence a list like this. But reading is also an individual pursuit, something that helps humans cultivate and refine our own values. So as useful and interesting as a list like this is to reflect upon, the greatest books of all time, we must also remember that a list like this can never be complete due to the fact that although we do and must remember, we unfortunately also forget. As W.H. Auden famously noted, some books are undeservedly forgotten. None are undeservedly remembered. So now I'm curious, what did this list miss in your view? What are the biggest omissions? What should have been higher? What should have been lower? And most importantly, does a list like this actually reflect the greatest books ever written? Why? Why not? If you enjoyed this, consider subscribing and liking the video. And comment below. See you in the next one.